With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness, enclosing my mind. Enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So we're presently looking at the 9th chapter in the Treasury of Precious Qualities. Let's see here. And this text is divided into, this particular chapter deals with how to apply the Bodhisattva vow. So we're looking at the bodhicitta of aspiration and the bodhicitta of application. And we're presently then in the second part, which is covering the bodhicitta of application, which is explained in terms of the 6 paramitas. And we're then presently looking at the paramita of Shila, the paramita of discipline. And in there, we've gone into quite some detail around what vows the monastics take, and what monastic, and not just actually monastic vows, but also in general what we call the pratimoksha vows, which also cover the commitments or the vows of the laity. But all these, you could say, all these vows, they're quite specific. And they really are intended to provide the framework for a lifestyle that is dedicated to enlightenment. So that's where, you know, you can say in the modern context, many of us are Buddhists, but we also see ourselves as part of a larger culture. And in that culture, sort of the idea of enlightenment and the path is not necessarily that prevalent, you know, unless you live in a very, you could say, precious, rarefied sphere of just seeing Buddhist practitioners. And of course, there's no doubt that all of us who are attending this study are committed to the path. But the pratimoksha vows, they are very encompassing and really are intended to create a very clear context for the practice of the Dharma. So we've seen that they are, you know, both particularly, of course, the monastic vows, but also the lay person's vows are styles of living that for many of us sound perhaps very alien. But at the same time, as I was also saying many times, even if we can't practice these, and these might not necessarily be, we might not necessarily presently see these as relevant for our own journey, they certainly represent the vows that monastics take. And for that reason, we then have a very good foundation for understanding the incredible commitment that monastics and some lay people really display in terms of their commitment to the path. Now, today we're going to be looking at, you could say, a more general understanding how these vows fit together in what we would generally refer to as the 3 vows that apply for monastics, for those on the Bodhisattva path, and then for the Vajrayana practitioners. And I really should stop saying monastics, because what we're talking about is, in fact, the vows of the pratimoksha, the individual liberation. But it's in there that you find the monastic vows, but they also do cover the vows of the individual liberation for lay people. So we have these 3, the vows of individual liberation, the vows of the bodhisattvas, and then what we call the vows for the Vijayadharas, those who engage with the Vajrayana path. So in the root text then, we say, it says here, 1 in nature, 56. So verse 56, stanza 56, 1 in nature, but of separate aspect. The 3 vows all subsist within the mind stream of a single individual. When they seem in contradiction, higher vows take precedence, for so the teaching of the accomplished masters of the past proclaims. So this in Tibetan is known as domsum, and particularly, which means the 3 vows, and the vows taking precedence, the higher they are, is known as Domsum Yarike. I think that's the term. Anyway, I shouldn't pretend to be that, that fluent in Tibetan, but it is an interesting theme that really, when there are vows that are, you could say, higher, then they're seen as more important than the ones that are lower. It will be explained here. Kangyur Rinpoche, he Domsum Yadan, in case anybody speaks Tibetan, that's what the word is, Domsum Yadan. Anyway, since the three kinds of vow transmute into each other, they partake of a single essential nature and are not considered as separate entities. Now, this is also something that will be emerging in this discussion here. When we say that they transmute into each other, that means that, for example, someone who practices the path on the basis of individual liberation, what we could call Hinayana, they organically, naturally would, you could say, graduate or lead to something greater beyond just the ordinary notion of nirvana as a confined individual liberation. The Hinayana would lead to, eventually, at least, lead to the Mahayana, which is then relinquishing the notion of the spiritual path as just being centered on oneself, and relinquishing the notion of self altogether, of course, is common along all the lines of Buddhism, but particularly the notions of even the consciousness having some, you could say, ultimate reality, and objects or the phenomenal world as such having, you could say, solidly existing building blocks. That is very common in the way that we understand science, right? So that's where the Mahayana goes even beyond the notion of such aspects as truly existing reference point, if you like. So neither consciousness of the phenomenal world is seen as having intrinsic ultimate truth to them, and also on the basis of such, you could say, lack of self, there's also no longer the notion of wishing to just slide into or recede into or enter into a private nirvana. The path is seen as one that is dedicated to enlightenment, that is not reserved to just a single entity, but is essentially organically present for all sentient beings. And thus the Bodhisattva takes the vow to commit to the liberation of all sentient beings. And that's why we could say this is a natural outgrowth or a natural extension, development of the path. And that then again is where the Bodhisattva eventually fully appreciates the purity of his or her own mind stream, as well as the purity of the phenomenal world. And that's where then the qualities of enlightenment are seen as being spontaneously present, which is then the vision of the Vajrayana. So in that sense, these vows, these disciplines that are associated with these various developments, first the individual liberation, then the Bodhisattva, and then the Vajrayana or the Vijayadhara vehicles, they partake of a single essential nature. They're simply the natural shedding of ignorance and the natural development of the qualities that are innate and which are then revealed, unveiled along the journey. So that's where this is where they all have, you could say, a singular intention, but of course they have their own particular methodologies and distinctive ways of praxis. So it says here, however, referring to the vows, they are distinct with regards to their respective aspects. And that's where aspects here is obviously an extensive discussion. It says here, Dokpa, for the sake of convenience, this is here simply rendered as aspect. In fact, it is a highly technical term used in logic. And that's where it refers to Paju's debate in Tibetan Buddhism. But Dokpa then is, but we sometimes would say a single essence, but different aspects. More chikla Dokpa Tade, a single essence, yet various aspects. And that, of course, you could say refers to the way that we experience reality. Reality has the nature of emptiness, and yet they appear distinctly as having various aspects. And that also then applies to these vows. So it says here, so that they remain unmingled in the mind of an individual until such time as they are broken. So these are the vows then. The principle of distinction according to aspect is a key point, on account of which each of the three vows must be kept at its own level without being confused. And that does mean that you have those that have ordination as monastics, who on the top of that then take the Bodhisattva vow, and on top of that practice the Vajrayana, and that's in no way contradictory. But at the same time, such individuals do uphold the monastic vows, even though they might be Vajrayana practitioners. And that's where sometimes there's a little bit of embarrassing confusion that takes place when you have persons that perhaps have taken monastic vows, but then all of a sudden starts behaving in ways that really they shouldn't, because that's sort of more the style of the Vajrayana practitioner, or the path of the Vajrayana practitioner. So that's where it's so important to really understand how these aspects apply. So that's where, it could happen. So it says here that this being so, it may be objected that the different vows contradict each other. And that's an important point in Tibetan Buddhism, that no, they don't. That means that you can have a monastic that at the same time is a Vajrayana practitioner. And particularly here now, it explains in terms of how someone who is a monastic can be a bodhisattva. But then again, the bodhisattva vow is, you could say, more significant. It says here, for example, the act of killing, which is forbidden by the pratimoksha vow, is said to be permitted in the case of a bodhisattva, while in the context of the unsurpassable mantrayana, it is advocated as an act that one should willingly perform, being the samaya of the Vajra lineage. And then Kangyur Rinpoche very appropriately says, what is one to make of this? Good question, right? Okay, 57. For even if there seems to be a conflict with the lower vows, there is agreement with their purpose. Harm must be avoided, benefit secured. True contradiction, if there were one, could not be permitted. If there is permission, there can be no contradiction. And that essentially boils down to simply trusting the wisdom of the Buddha and the Buddhist vows, and though you could say the vows that are there, and understanding that there in fact is no contradiction. Look, if you have a good friend that all of a sudden is acting strangely, you might, before you begin to think that they should be, I don't know, reported to the police, or that they're suspecting they've gone crazy, you might understand there might be a reason for it. So that's where trust means a lot. And of course, that's what applies here. That's where we would say we need to appreciate that there is in essence no contradiction. But there's of course it's of course justified to discuss this. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, in the discussion of the learned and accomplished masters of the past, who were thinking of practitioners who were well versed in the extraordinary attitude of altruism and had confidence and expertise in the stages of generation and perfection, referring to the Vajrayana practices of the generation and perfection of completion state. It is said that the greatest emphasis must be placed on the practice of bodhicitta and mantra. The essential meaning of this is explained as follows. To kill apparently violates the basic precepts of the pratimoksha, which is not to harm others and therefore to abstain from killing. So of course, this we all understand. This is, you could say, the ultimate aggression, really, to take someone else's life. And that's exactly what we don't do. But a bodhisattva who kills, for example, an evil and dangerous man, interrupts the stream of the man's actions and thereby reduces his suffering. So it's very interesting in this famous anecdote we have from the sutras, where Buddha in a previous life as a bodhisattva took out this man who had the intention to kill a large number of merchants. And the Buddha's motivation was not that he was feeling sorry for the merchants, which he probably did anyway, but it was more that he could see that that act would lead this man into infinite number of lifetimes within the hells. And also there's the famous story of Paltra Rinpoche's student who one day saw a hunter chasing a deer, and they were just so outraged at the hunter. And Paltra Rinpoche scolded them, saying, you know, it's not, you shouldn't be angry at the hunter. You should have compassion for him. He's the one who's accumulating negative karma. So that's where the Bodhisattva vow is really thinking in a greater manner beyond just the scope of the individual liberation. But of course, it doesn't mean bodhisattvas go around killing people either. But it's more just to understand that intention is what counts. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, the purpose of this deed is manifestly in agreement with the goal of pratimoksha, not to harm, but to establish happiness and to plant the seed of liberation. And that is the case. The Buddha's intention was, in fact, killing this man presumably would have purified some of his karma, and it also would prevent his future suffering. Let's see what it says here. Okay, then there's a comment about the next few stanzas. This apparently comes from Dilgo Kangyur Rinpoche, who says next two stanzas. The next two verses are not by Jigme Lingpa, but it also says some say, because it fits into the text, so it's not really something we should be too concerned about either. Anyway, 58. And so it is that alcohol, downfall for the Shravakas, are considered likewise a fault for the Bodhisattvas, and considered likewise as a fault for Bodhisattvas, is in the Mantrayana savored as a substance of samaya by those for whom the host of thoughts arise as deities. Both alcohol and attitude are just transformed. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for us who are committed to Vajrayana, because then again, we are understanding what attitude is about and also the way that Vajrayana approaches things and also what is meant with deities. Some interesting discussions that now follow. It says then, if, however, an action truly contradicts the three vows, again, the vow of the individual liberation, the bodhisattva, and the practice of the Vijayadharas, which the Buddha, skilled in means, set forth in accordance with the various capacities and aspirations of beings, then it is in no way admissible. Okay? So that's where if something is done, you could say in a frivolous manner, in an ignorant manner, then it is in contradiction with the vows. If killing is undertaken without compassion, or if even you can say anything that goes against the vows, and if they're done really in a manner which contradicts the intention, which is liberation, then of course it's not in no way admissible. So you can't have somebody who is a Vajrayana practitioner who then gets drunk just because they think that they just feel like getting drunk. That has nothing to do with Vajrayana practice. And this, of course, is something that happens, and it's very embarrassing for Vajrayana practitioners. It's also embarrassing for bodhisattvas. If bodhisattvas lie and that they then say, oh, I did it out of compassion. But in fact, the intention is not there. Then it does contradict the three vows. So then it is in no way admissible. Conversely, if certain apparently unvirtuous actions are permitted, the reason is that they do not ultimately violate the precepts So again, this is where we could have actions that look as if they are negative. For all the teachings of the omniscient Buddha, whether expedient or absolute, are all united in one essential intention. And that's where we have the vows such as, well, we have, for example, all the various vows that are expedient in terms of, for example, the monastic vows are really just skillful means, and the various vehicles, they're all skillful means. So that's where we have all these teachings on the path. But the objective of all these teachings, they are to realize the absolute or the definitive meaning. And that's then what we could call the teachings that are absolute. So regardless of whether these are the teachings that constitute the method or the expedient means, or the teachings that have to do with the absolute nature of reality, they all have one single intention. This is especially so in the context of the extraordinary view and meditation of the Mantrayana. Okay, so that's where the Mantrayana is intended on seeing the purity of the individual, seeing the purity of phenomena according to the definitive meaning. But that's where the understanding accommodates both that phenomena appear and also have understood to have no, you could say, intrinsic absolute nature. So that's where the Vajrayana takes onto the path this vision of the unity of appearance and emptiness. So at that point, then the Vajrayana is founded on what is known as pure view, and the view that all what appears is intrinsically pure as deity and mandala. And that's where there's no ordinary concepts for someone who is practicing this. Of course, this again has to do with degrees of realization, but at least the discipline and the view of the Mantrayana is such that we are, you could say, viewing phenomena as deity and mandala. So that's also where there's different style, different lifestyle, different style of practice that applies. Alcohol, the taking of which is a downfall according to the Shravaka Pratimoksha, according to what we could call the Hinayana vow of individual liberation. Alcohol taken in that context constitutes a fault in the Bodhisattva discipline. It's a fault there, and it's also a fault in the Bodhisattva discipline. It's regarded in the Mantrayana as a substance of samaya that must always be present. So we've looked at how in the Pratimoksha one takes various vows, but particularly if one also has taken the vow of abstaining from alcohol, because one could say, oh, well, alcohol, you're not killing anybody, you're not harming anybody, and so on. You're not stealing, you're not committing sexual misconduct, and so on. Yes, but if one takes alcohol, then one is more likely to commit such negative actions. So that's where alcohol is seen as being a problem in these vows. But then we have the Mantrayana, where we see things in a different way. And there's a quote then from, you say, the most important of all Vajrayana teachings, especially in the Nyingma teaching, is what is known as the Guhyagarbha Tantra, which is the Tantra that explains the natural presence of wisdom within all perceptions. And that's where it says, meat and alcohol must not be lacking, for they are substance of accomplishment. Food and drink, essences and fruits, and all that is a pleasure to the senses. So that's where the senses, the pleasures of the senses are brought onto the path, not from a frivolous perspective, but as a means to connect with the experience of, you could say, absence of delusion through the manner of bliss. The senses then being a vehicle for this insight. And then it says also, in particular, it is improper for meat and alcohol to be lacking. So this we see often in the instructions, also in particular sadhanas, like in the gathering of the Vijayadharas, in the Longchen Yingtik and so on. It says that alcohol and meat has to be there. But that's also where you very often have, you could say, vegetarians who also are Vajrayana practitioners, and who, of course, would say, yes, that is so true, but then they omit meat anyway. This I've seen with my teachers. So that's where meat and alcohol has to be present. Oh, yes. And then without flinching, they'll bring in juice and, you know, something vegetarian to represent that. But there's still the respect for the Vajrayana intention. Anyway, there are different views on that depending on the various teachers. It is thought that Kangyur Rinpoche says, and by the way, again, I should stress, Kangyur Rinpoche himself was a vegetarian. And it's generally said that in Kangyur Rinpoche's monastery, there was no meat to be had, except for one or two people who, doctor's orders, had to have meat. Anyway, it says here, it is taught that such substances are to be enjoyed by yogis who, by means of the practice of the stages of generation and perfection, are able to overcome the power of their thoughts, which at first seem so solid and real, but which at length appear as the very deity. And that's where ordinary perceptions, which we all blindly believe in, they are gradually, through the practice of the path, they're weakened in their ordinary obscured aspect, and the clarity that emerges is then the basis for pure perception. And that's where we would say thoughts eventually appear as the deity. Now here comes something that's very interesting in the way that we understand deity. It says here, in general, this refers to the aspirational deity for those who are on the path of accumulation, to the deity of wind mind for those who are on the path of joining, to the deity of luminosity for those who are on the path of seeing, to the deity of the united level of learning for those who are on the path of meditation, and to the deity of the united level of the Dharmakaya and Rupakaya for those who are on the path of no more learning. So there we can see that deity is essentially the awakened quality that is uncorrupted. We could say the way that we connect with Buddha nature. And this we then do on the path of accumulation, the aspirational deity, which is in that case then the visualized deity that one would do in sadhana practice. Then there's the deity of wind mind that one would do at the level of the second and third empowerment, and then the deity of luminosity for the practice of the fourth empowerment. And so that's where, let's just see here, the spontaneous display of wisdom. This is then deity as, not as we sometimes think of as deity, like, you know, like visualized form, you know, dakini or yidams and so on, but rather as then, you could say, increasingly subtle ways of connecting with the nature, with Buddha nature. Here then we have a footnote that says, and this is from Yenten Gyatso, the aspirational deity on the path of accumulation is the deity contrived by thought at the generation stage only. Okay, this is sadhana practice, visualization. It is, however, linked with the wisdom of the perfection stage. And again, the deity that we have in sadhana practice, of course, is continually referring to the wisdom nature of this, the intangible quality of of wisdom, and that's then further enhanced through then the practice of yoga. So it says here, by contrast, on the next path, the path of joining, the deity of wind mind is not contrived by thought. It is a deity manifesting in the manner of an illusion from the strength of familiarity with the conceptual phase of the perfection stage. And that is where this is practice of the completion stage. It's a practice of completion stage where we say there is still some reference point. And that's where wisdom is connected with, not in terms of the way that it's visualized as deity, also not free from reference points as we would find it, say, in the practice of the great perfection, but rather as a way of connecting with the wisdom that abides as experience with the body. And that's where then this, you could say, subtle aspect of our being, the wind mind, is understood in terms of its wisdom. So that's where this deity is then something that is still that connects us with Buddha nature on a more subtle level. On the path of seeing, that then refers to the seeing of the actual nature, Dhammata. The deity of luminosity is the spontaneous radiance of ultimate wisdom, actualized during the non-conceptual phase of the perfection stage. So that's where we then look at practices like what we call the great perfection, Sokchen or Mahamudra, which is then doesn't have a conceptual reference point, and which is then, you could say, the actual settling into wisdom itself. So on the path of meditation, one speaks of the deity as the united level of the path of learning. So that's where, like, we have this note from Dinghuchen's Rinpoche, which is simply the display of wisdom. And then when this fully manifests, that's then where it says, while at the level of Buddhahood, the union of Dharmakaya and Rupakaya is called the deity of the united level of no more learning. The Sungjuk or Yoganada, the unity of, you could say, the quality of enlightenment that is the wisdom of knowing things as they are, Dharmakaya, and also the wisdom of knowing how phenomena appear to sentient beings, which is the Rupakaya. And it's then from there that the Buddha is able to benefit sentient beings. So that's where we should appreciate the depth, really, of the Vajrayana path. And of course, so often in the modern world of Buddhism, then the sort of the idea that in Tibetan Buddhism you have deity is very often poorly understood by those who haven't actually been, you could say, empowered, and also don't have the foundation really for understanding what deity truly means. So again, this is, of course, to understand then the perspectives that are basis for the various practices of the vows. So 59 then says, they are not monks, nor are they bodhisattvas. They are not those who, without means to harness it, repudiate desire, nor yet are they defeated by defilement. To those for whom all things appear as deities and mandalas, and as amrita, substance of samaya to be taken and enjoyed. To those with changed perceptions thus, such things have been allowed. Compared with gifts made to the Sangha, monks who hold the Pratimoksha or the Bodhisattva vows, offerings proffered to the Yidam are of greater merit. To other aspects of the precepts, the same should be applied. So that's why it's important to understand then that the Vajrayana discipline in no way has to do with succumbing to ordinary habitual desire and the general causes of suffering. So it says here, Kangyur Rinpoche says, practitioners of the inner tantras of the Mantrayana act without dualistic clinging in such a way as to support their view of the purity and equality of phenomena. So anything that the yogis of the Vajrayana do are intended, and you can say the discipline of the Vajrayana is intended to consolidate and enhance realization of the particular view of the Vajrayana, which is what we refer to as the higher two truths. Now, all of us are familiar with the two truths as it exists in the Buddhist teaching, which is, of course, there's the truth of the appearances, but appearances are very different whether or not we understand their nature. And that's for us to actually no longer be deceived by appearances. There has to be the insight into the absolute nature of what we perceive. So that's what we call absolute truth. But of course, things still do perceive, and this is what we call conventional truth. So this understanding of the two truths we have all along the line in the Buddhist teaching, seeing beyond appearances. This is also what we do in science, in ordinary science. To understand things, we look, what are they actually made of? What are they actually? What is their nature? And so in the Buddhist teaching, the understanding of suffering is that it comes from simply not understanding phenomena, not understanding reality. And that's where we need to, in addition to understand the way that things appear, understand the way that they are. But for somebody who understands then the way that phenomena are, along with their appearances, that's where we would say then there is the insight into how phenomena intrinsically exist in their pure aspect. And that's where then the Vajrayana that then is based on the authentic experience of the unity of appearance and emptiness, then establishes relative truth as purity. Any impurity, that's our projection, if you like. We project all sorts of things onto ourselves and onto the world that are delusional, that don't actually have basis. But when there's no longer this delusion, and when there is an understanding of how things intrinsically are free from the solidity that we attribute to them, then we understand that phenomena exist. You can say innocently, free of our projections, they exist as the unity of appearance and emptiness. And that is the foundation for then the notion of deity. And that is where we then see relative truth as purity, and understand that in reality, there has never been any confusion veering into samsara and nirvana. And as such, both samsara and nirvana are seen as abiding as great equality. This is simply just adapting to the way that you could say the scope of realized beings. So we would say on the Bodhisattva path, this insight is something that happens naturally from the 11th bhumi onwards. But on the Vajrayana path, then we would say even individuals who have some foundation and who have devotion to the teacher and who, through the blessing of the teacher, could recognize wisdom that is not contaminated by our ordinary dualistic fixation, can appreciate how phenomena innately exist in this manner of purity and equality. So this is then the discipline of the Mantrayana. This, of course, is explained in far greater detail in the second volume of the Treasury of Precious Qualities. But then it says here, through the skillful means of the generation states, meaning the practice of visualization, where we recognize the nature of phenomena, their own aggregates and elements, meaning our experience of our skandhas, as well as also the perception of the phenomenal world out there, the elements, the universe itself, and all the beings that inhabit it arise as the display of the deity, mantra, and mudra. So that's where we see things in terms of simply being the way that they appear according to the form, the mantra, and also the expressions, the experiences. All are seen in the manner of purity. Such practitioners, this of course is the yoga practice then of the Vajrayana. Such practitioners bless the substances of the sacred feast or tzok offering, transforming them into amrita. And when they enjoy them, the alcohol is no longer ordinary, neither is their attitude one of ordinary indulgence. Within this state of great purity and equality, their perceptions are transmuted, and they experience themselves as the deity and the alcohol as amrita. So of course here there's absolutely no interest in, or rather there's no ordinary attachment to alcohol as we ordinarily perceive it. In such circumstances, yogis and yoginis are allowed to consume alcohol. They do not cling out of self-interest to ethical precepts concerning what is to be adopted or abandoned, regarding them as truly existent and immutable values. And they are not attached to their self-image as bhikkhus and bhikkhunis. So that's where yogis are not, you could say, limited by what we then would refer to as the lower vehicles. And that is then where we would say the higher vehicle supersedes the lower vehicle of the lower vows. Neither do they cling to the notion of altruistic generosity in the relative materialistic sense, clinging to the idea of bodhisattvas. And that's again where the Vajrayana, in its seeing the intrinsic purity of reality, are no longer caught in that dualistic notion of, oh, I am being a wonderful bodhisattva. I'm being, a very nice person. Me superior to the others, or Mr. or Mrs. Wonderful here as a bodhisattva. And that's where it's free from this kind of what then from the Vajrayana perspective is seen as a materialistic perception, a dualistic way of seeing things. It says yogis and yoginis who are thus allowed to partake of alcohol are not like Shravakas who must repudiate desire because they have no means whereby defilements and sensual pleasures may be harnessed on the spiritual path. And that's where within the particular practices of what we then would refer to as the Shravakayana or the Hinayana, then there are no means to integrate the senses, and there's no means to see the experience of the person and the phenomenal world as it's seen within the context of the Vajrayana discipline. So it's a very different kind of discipline that doesn't accommodate the transmutation of defilements and sense pleasures. Then it also says, neither are such practitioners, the yogis and yoginis, like ordinary people who, in the grip of negativity, accumulate actions that propel them into samsaric existence. And that's again, through the ordinary dualistic clinging, then the kleshas then fuel further karma that generates suffering. Through the profound yogas of generation and perfection, all perceptions are transmuted, all appearances become the infinite mandala of deities. The samaya substances, alcohol and so forth, are enjoyed as amrita, and for that reason they may be consumed. Not only is no fault committed, but merit increases. For yogis and yoginis who enjoy such samaya substances are in fact making offerings to the three jewels and the Idam deity. It is thus that their accumulation of merit and their development of spiritual qualities are enhanced far more intensely than if they were to make offerings to the Sangha that is composed of monks and nuns confined to the Pratimoksha discipline, or of ordained bodhisattvas who strive for the sake of others, but who as yet lack the view of purity and equality. So that's where, for the practitioners, and of course this was written within a context of Tibetan culture, which for a very long time had, you could say, both a culture of learning and understanding what is being talked about here, and also a culture of realization that you had men and women who were not bound by their ordinary confusion, and for whom then this discipline was, you could say, highly appropriate. And also there we have references to it when we are in our, you could say, in our culture of Vajrayana, in Siddhartha's intent and in other modern sanghas also, even though we are sort of, you would say, at an early stage of understanding what all this is about, there's references to how deity, how the sok offerings are consumed as deity, and references to then the yoga practices of, you could say, integrating the senses. So that's where, at that point, then one is making offerings to Buddha nature, one is making offerings to the ultimate three jewels and to the ultimate nature of the Yidam deity. And that's where offering in this way supersedes or surpasses the merit if one was to make offerings to, you could say, an ordinary sangha both of the ordained sangha and also the bodhisattva, the monastic sangha and also the bodhisattva sangha. Okay. So then there's a question here. What if the action was taken by insecurity? Well, this is where, when we act, it has consequences. And of course, one of the ways that you could say deluded action takes place is on the basis of confusion. So when we act, if we act in confused ways, it brings about suffering. And one of the defining features of our confusion is insecurity. So yes, when actions are done on the basis of insecurity, then of course it has its consequences, and that's where the entire, you could say, purpose of the path is actually to extract us from such insecurity and all the other many kind of mental factors that contribute to our suffering, such as, for example, the kleshas, attachment, aversion, and so forth. So anyway, so then the observance of the three vows as taught in the Nyingma tradition. When harnessing negative emotion and desire for sense objects with a view to progress on the spiritual path, the yogi must know how to apply the same reasoning to all other aspects of the precepts, both major and minor. Beginners in the practice of the three vows must, however, strive to keep as well as possible all the precepts of the three vows. To this vow, it is essential to understand the teaching of our tradition on this question, summarized as it is under 6 headings. So now we'll look at how the three vows, again, what we call the domsum, or the three vows, are taught within the Nyingma tradition. Okay, I think we'll just do one of them, and please, if there's any questions, feel free. So 61 then reads, so we talked about how the way in which we offer within the Vajrayana to the deity, as you could say, as inner offering, how this surpasses outer offerings. And then it says, but the respective aspects of the vows are not alloyed or mixed as antidote, and in their purpose, they are all the same. The vows are gradually transmuted and their qualities enhanced. They thus remain without essential contradiction. Their observance should be fitted to the situation. So this means that, of course, the vows, when we practice them, they should be practiced according to their particular context. So as monastics, then we make sure to abide by the monastic vows. They all serve as remedy for fundamental confusion. They all serve to bring about enlightenment. But the way that one graduates from them then is what renders the higher vows more important. So that's where it's just important to understand how they all, you could say, are singular in their intention. There's no contradiction. It says here, let's see again, there's a comment here on aspects. Oh, okay. The aspects, the particular aspects, they're distinct. Yeah, the aspects remain distinct. The respective aspects of the three vows are not confused. The authorities from whom one receives the three vows, meaning one's teachers, the attitude with which one takes the vows, and the rituals wherewith one takes them, all these aspects have their own particular character. So the ways in which one receives monastic ordination, the ways in which one receives bodhisattva vow, the ways in which one receives the Vajrayana empowerment, they all have their own particular teachers, their own particular vows, their own particular rituals. So they are distinct. Even the duration of the vows is clearly different. The characteristics of the vows are peculiar to each level and do not overlap. Because the vows are differentiated in this way, they must be observed according to their respective character. And if an infraction occurs, it must be repaired according to the provisions established for each vow. So again, that's where these all need to be held and understood in terms of the value of their particular context, the individual liberation and so forth. 2, the 3 vows are the same, both in purpose and as antidote. Okay, what's this here? Gaku Sangwa. Okay, what it stops and what the purpose is. Okay. Each of the 3 vows fulfills 2 functions. Each is an antidote to negativities, and each fulfills the purpose of freeing the mind. So that's where, again, you might think that, oh, if you're in a monastic, you're very narrow-minded, but that's not at all the case. The monastic vow provides for a mind of peace, a mind that then can gain an insight, and a mind that essentially begins to, you could say, connect with the greater potential of our being. So there's no, very often there is sort of a chauvinism and poo-pooing of the lower vows, sometimes in the language of very ignorant people. What actually is significant of the higher teachings, and particularly when we come to teachings such as the Great Perfection, is an understanding how all the various aspects of the path, right from the Pratimoksha through Bodhisattva to the Vajrayana and the Great Perfection, all serve as incredibly valuable aspects of essentially this single nature of awakening. And it's, you could say, the project of its recovery, if you like. So each is an antidote to negativities, each of these vows, and each fulfills the purpose of freeing the mind. As an illustration of this, consider a garden in which a poisonous plant is growing. An ignorant gardener, without experience, will dig up the plant and throw it away. By contrast, the physician may be able to prepare medicine from the plant, which will be beneficial in treating diseases. Finally, a person skilled in mantra is able, through the application of mantric power, to give the poison an even greater beneficial potency. Each of these approaches is a way of neutralizing the poison, and arranged hierarchically, each method outstrips the one preceding it in terms of ease and efficiency. In parallel with this image, the Shravakas, who regard negative emotions as existing entities, not merely on the relative, but even on the absolute level, tether their mind with the vows of pratimoksha. And that's a good thing. If you're having, if we're indulging the causes of suffering, namely the kleshas, then obviously something needs to be done, and that's what the pratimoksha vows provide. By binding the doors of the senses, they curb their behavior, principally that of word and deed, meaning in action. Behavior. This is the Shravaka method for dealing with defilement. As the Pratimoksha Sutra says, the ever-striving, ever-restless mind the ever-striving, ever-restless mind, a stallion, wild and difficult to tame. The harness of the Pratimoksha vow is bit and bridle for the curbing of the mind. The Bodhisattvas, for their part, consider that emotional defilement, though without ultimate existence, nevertheless imprisons them on a relative level. They therefore strive to disperse of it in the expanse of ultimate reality. i.e., by the realization of emptiness. So this, of course, is the, you could say, the culmination of the path, the paramita path. In the Bodhisattva Pratimoksha Sutra, the Buddha speaks about this at some length. The Buddha says, when a bodhisattva, O Shariputra, perfectly observes his own desire, he examines the ground, meaning the phenomena, from which desire has sprung. Searching perfectly, he finds nothing. Whence does desire originate? Who gives birth to it, and how? Indeed, the bodhisattva finds no arising, nor any subject to experience it, nor any way in which arising might occur. No desire is found. So here what the Buddha is saying is analyze the object and write down, not just stop at the surface, but really into its nature. And that's where we see its emptiness. Similarly, analyze the one that gives rise to the reaction to this object, the subject, and see if there can be found any reality. And again, if we don't stop, if we keep going, then we'll find that this has no tangible, true existence. So therefore it says, for the bodhisattva, therefore, desire does not result in wrong actions, having that insight of emptiness. On the contrary, it is productive of positive qualities. Thus, the bodhisattva does not impugn desire, but praises it. And that is where, at the basis of liberating desire, there is the confidence in which the arising of desire no longer becomes filtered through the dualistic neurosis of our ordinary habit, but rather the nature of the mind's, you could say, display is then what we would call wisdom. This creates a bigger mind. It's very different from simply suppressing it or saying, oh, there's nothing there or whatever. This is where the mind then blossoms. In the general context of the Vajrayana, negative emotions, even on the relative level, are not regarded as defects. Like hard ice melting into liquid water, they are brought onto the path. Being of the nature of deities, the 5 Buddha lineages and wisdoms. So that's where the Vajrayanists, seeing phenomena in terms of what they actually are, and seeing their own being in terms of deity, and seeing the purity of phenomena, they are seeing the same, you could say, arrive at the same experience as the bodhisattva, but at the same time, the perception, the appearances are seen in there without the contamination. So not just seeing emptiness, but also seeing the appearances as permeated by emptiness, then phenomena arise as deities. So that's where we would say the objective is the same, but the proximity is greater. And in this way, the fruit is swiftly gained. As it is said in the Tantra Gyamtso-ju, says, defilement is a pure and skillful path, and objects of desire, the supreme ornament. By tasting of them, each and every one, you speedily become the glorious Heruka. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, indeed, for those who have truly realized the ultimate reality, defiled emotions are the sublime ornament of wisdom. It is said in the Tantra, Kunshe Gyalpo, the all-creating king. Craving anger, ignorance, arising on the path, great enlightenment, the 5 sense objects that are all enjoyed, these wondrously adorn the great expanse. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, it is like the peacock that feeds indiscriminately on poisonous flowers, thereby becoming ever more youthful and beautiful in its plumage. Okay, I think time is up here, and in case there's any questions, I think we'll leave it at that.
May I ask a question?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, so see if I can find the right words. So it's about the, the different levels, the 3 vows. I feel like, I still feel a little bit confused with that. Also, in terms of pratimoksha vows, does that refer to, I mean, like the entire Shravaka level, also meaning the entire Theravada level, say, the entire Pali Buddhism practice, so to speak. Is that what is meant by Pratimoksha vow, or what does it exactly refer to?
You know, that's a good question, because I think it's important to realize that the language we have in the Mahayana that refers to Hinayana is not necessarily about the Theravadan tradition. See, the language that evolved in India and Tibet around, you could say, the view on Hinayana very much is from the point of view of the Mahayana. And like I always like to say, I don't think the Theravadan traditions particularly want to be, you could say, framed as corresponding to what we call the Hinayana. I know some people, they would say, out of political correctness, they would say, oh, it's not nice to say Hinayana, and let's say Theravadan. But that's only when we begin to think that Hinayana is actually the Theravadan tradition. And Hinayana, we really should understand, is a Mahayana terminology for particularly then those who take the vows, which you do within the Mahayana. So it's really, you could say, within the family itself, we're criticizing our own mob. And not going over and saying, oh, the people in Thailand or the people in Sri Lanka, they're doing this and that. The Mahayana is not qualified to actually speak about that. They evolved along their own, you could say, parameters in their particular countries. So when we're talking about the Shravaka, we're really just talking about within the tradition how the monastic vow is practiced in the Mahayana, in the Indian and in the Tibetan traditions.
All right.
And that's why you could say they're qualified to talk about them, because like Kangyur Rinpoche, for a large part of his life, he was a holder of the Pratimoksha vow. He eventually, had a family. But so many of the great masters, they abide by the Pratimoksha vows. Like His Holiness the Dalai Lama is an example of somebody who's a monk, and yet a bodhisattva, and yet a Vajrayana practitioner.
Well, that really helps. Thank you for clarifying that. Also, I find it, I mean, I started mixing it all up, I guess, and also feel like, the theme of emptiness, for example, it is a big theme in the Theravada, in the Pali teachings, isn't it? And it's not just anatta, it's actually shunyata.
Yes.
So this is where I got a little bit confused right now. So, but this now really helps. Thank you.
Absolutely. Sure.
Yes.
By the way, Tineke, it won't end here. You'll have plenty more confusion about this. Believe me.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Looking forward to it. always welcome.
Confusion and questions, they enhance our understanding. So, there will be things, there's ways also how we define emptiness. We'll look at that in the section of Prajna, yeah? Yeah,
but this is really, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to ask this question, because it has been going, not just today, but for a long time, so how is this all, what is exactly meant by these, these explanations, and where does it refer to? And this now clarifying it. Thank you.
Well, I'm glad you've stuck with us thus far, despite these doubts.
Oh, well, well, yes, of course. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, I think then we'll conclude with dedication, and let's see here. Oh, just a sec. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together.